The RSPs are already deploying artillery. Things aren't going well. For the last time, General Tullius Capricornicus III, I don't see how buying 50 tons of grain is going to help in the war effort.
Alright, I have several questions about everything that's happening over here, but first would be, why am I here? Can I go home?
You have been chosen as my personal remembrancer for the duration of this war.
What the hell is a remembrancer?
Glorified propaganda journalist, pretty much an IGN employee.
And I should stay here documenting your war that you're fighting by having a goat as the general of your troops? I have a life to live, where generally less ridiculous things happen.
We both know that is a lie, Mr. 21 hours long berserk video.
Alright man, no need to be rude.
You ask me when this great and noble work of ours will be done? It will end only when we have divided every sentient thing in this vast and wide cosmos into one of two separate and primary orders of being. The righteous and the dead. So, regretting having a goat as your general yet?
Don't all kill of Tullius Capricornicus III. That goat has seen more action than many POs have in their lifetimes.
And the bombs raining on the basement are proof of that?
They made me spill my coffee. Other than that, I don't mind them.
Now, before starting, you know the drill. We want to thank all of our followers, members and patrons for all their support and help. And you can become a supporter too, either on Patreon, Subscribestar or Ko-Fi, and enjoy exclusive perks and even exclusive access to the full series of Lore Destroyers. Remember to also follow us on Twitch, where we stream 3 times a week, so we hope to see you in chat to enjoy our misadventures.
Yeah, but I can't run. And it's very weird.
Yeah, it is a problem. It is a problem, Pio. The disconnected. You're fine now. What the fuck? Pio, why are you an alien going back to his planet? Okay, good, Draken. Okay.
The Emperor is helping me.
the Emperor is calling him home.
It's not the Emperor, it's the Chaos Gods. Help! I can't move.
Now, I think people have waited long enough. Let's get our boots finally in the trenches of Vraks. 790, 812 and 41. 200,000 guardsmen of the Krieg 143rd Siege Regiment march in ranks up the boarding ramps and into the holds of their transport vessels. The first Kriegs of the 88th Siege Army to begin their journey to Vraks. And these were just the first vessels and soldiers preparing to reach Vraks. Lord Commander Zuelk established his headquarters on Trajan Primaris, a principal planet of the Scarus sector. As it is usual of extremely shitty commanders in 40k, he would oversee the campaign from far away, in the safety of a peaceful world, while others did the fighting for him. The first convoy of transport ships carrying men, equipment and supplies from Krieg began to arrive in the Vraks system in 199, 812 and 41. The vanguards of the 88th Siege Army was carried in 21 transport vessels of various sizes, protected by a fleet of Imperial Navy escort ships under the command of Admiral Rasiak from his flagship, the cruiser Lord Bellerophon. The defenders had no fleet to contrast the incoming armada, so on the far side of the planet, away from the citadel, the landing operations could begin in relative security. The landing zones had been chosen to provide the 88th Siege Army with a secure bridgehead on the surface, a place to build up its supplies and regiments before any battle would be fought. But the landing sites needed protection against possible enemy attacks, so the first regiment to land, the 143rd, set about digging in. They began digging trenches, making use of Atlas excavators, an engineering variant of the Atlas recovery tank, carrying trench digging equipment, and set about plowing up the trench lines. Once that was done, minefields and razor wire were added to the defenses. The 143rd Regiment's Death Rider companies were sent to patrol the surrounding terrain, to seek out any sign of an approaching enemy attack, but they all reported just a barren and empty wilderness. No move was undertaken to try and prevent the landings of the Kriegers on the planet. The landing zones were full of activity for months, landing ships ferrying more troops and more guns down from orbit, shuttles moving back and forth to carry down supplies that were organized in stockpiles, food, ammunition, water, and all kind of equipment required for the the 12 years of war that were projected. All of this while the full 88 Siege Army regiments were traveling to the planet. It took almost a year for the full army to converge on the planet, and in the meantime, the Departmentum Unitorum had also landed a large labor corps. It consisted of half a million men from the penal colonies of Arfista, with a special mission to assist the war effort. The army was over 1,000 miles from their first objective, and the travel was impossible by foot or even vehicles, so an alternative transport system had been planned. The labor corps immediately started digging and laying railway lines, working day and night without ever stopping, and the railway extended northwards rapidly. A delegation of Adeptus Mechanicus engineers arrived and brought with them locomotives, and put them in place on the new railway system. At 965, 812 and 41, the first locomotive set off, carrying the men and guns of the 3rd Siege Regiment. It powered across the Saritama plains night and day, and on arrival, the regiment established a forward depot. They were now less than 100 miles from the enemy's lines. From here it was on the men to march to the front, as the locomotives went back and forth non-stop, carrying men and guns forward. The logistical support for sustaining the Krieg regiment's needs during the war was now in place. Now the plan of attack was simple. It was based around repeated offensive on two fronts, the northern front of the defense system of the Citadel, and at the same time attacking from the western defense lines, hoping to overrun the outer defense line, before the army would reorganize and probe the second defense line for weaknesses before committing to major attacks. Once the second line fell, the ring around Vraks Citadel could close in again to the inner defense line, entirely encircling the Citadel and for the first time, bringing it under long-range artillery fire. At that point the plan was to sit and wait, as the enemy was pinned down, and the artillery barrages would over time annihilate them.
Ambitious plan, but this is 40k. The chances that something will fuck it up are pretty much 100%.
166, 813 and 41. As the sun slowly shined across the Van Meersland wastes, sentries in the outpost of Vraks' outer defense lines stared, bleary-eyed, out across the cold, dusty landscape. Miles away to the west, many eyes stared back, watching through rangefinder surveyors and scanners, and awaiting the order to fire. Gun crews waited beside their guns in waiting for the order to arrive. Finally, the Vox came to life, and the commander raised his arm in view of the gun crews. Once the order was confirmed, his arm fell, and the order came.
Open fire!
Nearly 15 kilometers away, shells started violently landing, throwing pulverized stone and grey dust into the sky in thick plumes, before violently exploding, sending shards and shrapnel in all directions. Slowly the crescendo of explosions grew as the gunners took up a rhythm with firing and reloading their guns. Earthshaker rounds and bombard shells were raining on the outer defense lines of the Citadel, leaving great craters in the soft earth where they landed. Rocks the size of paving slabs were tossed into the air, falling back down like rain, only to be flung up again as the next artillery shell impacted and detonated. All morning the bombardment went on, explosion after explosion, until the gun barrels of the 88th Siege Army began to glow red with the heat of firing. Meanwhile, behind the outer defense line's forward position, the defenders' gunners were racing to respond with counter-battery fire. Basilisk artillery pieces moved forward into pre-prepared firing pits, well protected from the enemy fire. Their banner raised to the sky and they started firing back against the Krieg. The artillery duel had finally begun. As the two sides exchanged fire incessantly, an enemy shell ended up hitting the 413th Krieg artillery battery, scoring a direct hit, smashing an Earthshaker cannon to pieces like a child's toy, detonating the ammunition stockpile close by and killing all 8 members of the gun's crew in the ensuing inferno. This artillery duel would not be one-sided, that was for sure. As the artillery duel continued, the men of the 158th Regiment advanced at an even pace, each man 5 yards apart, long dark ranks of trench-coated, gas-masked figures, moving steadily forward across no man's land, almost ignored by the artillery duel happening over their heads. The orders were to advance steadily towards the enemy, then halt and start to dig in the first trenches. The plan was not to attack the enemy yet. The bombardment was a covering one, so that the Krieg soldiers would be left alone by the enemy, and not harassed as they dug in. The plan was to establish a well-organized trench network, and the soldiers got to work extremely fast. And the trenches grew from simple foxholes to entire trench lines in a matter of days. The men had to fight even against the storms of the planet that showered their trenches in rainwater, leaving them as swamps of clawing grey slime. Within a week the forward positions were in place, and more work went underway for communication trenches and tunnels moving forwards from which they could harass the enemy position. And despite the death core methodical digging, the enemy did not attack. Pinned under the daily bombardments, they clung to their solid bunkers and defense lines. Cardinal Zaphan's renegade army was staring at the Kriegs digging down a trench parallel to their outer defense lines, without offering any resistance but the occasional sniper shot or fire exchange with the Krieg artillery. But their defense lines were nonetheless formidable. Killing zones, barricades, trenches, tank traps, razor wires, as well as anti-tank ditches and minefields. Finally, as the trench lines were structured and reinforced, the first order of attack came. The 149th Regiment was chosen to make the first assault in Sector 4639. From intelligence reports, gathered from information known before the uprising, it was felt that the defense line might be more easily broken here. Work here had not been completed, and it provided a chance for the desired rapid breakthrough. On the 149th Regiment's immediate left and right flanks, the 133rd and 150th Regiments will provide strong supporting attacks, mainly as a diversion for the 149th, so that their attack had higher chances to be successful. Behind the 149th Regiment, units of the 11th Assault Corps were brought up and made ready. Should the first attack deliver the required hole in the line, then the Assault Corps tank units could drive through and thrust deeper in the defense zone. 212, 813, and 41. The first infantry attack was set to begin. 500,000 men would attack in waves on the course of 2 days. The first wave was not expected to make much progress, but was to attack with strong infantry probes to find weak spots in the enemy lines. The second wave, led by grenadier units, would hit these weak spots hard, gain a foothold in the defense lines, and hold them until day 2, when the third wave will move through them and expand the hole. Once this part of the plan was completed, the 61st Tank Regiment will be released from reserve to smash through the hole in the defense line. Preparations were underway, large number of guns from the Bombardment Corps and more men for the infantry companies were being brought forward into position, all the time under enemy artillery fire. The plan was complex and required a constant support of artillery and bombards. For that purpose, over 4 million artillery shells have been stockpiled to support the offensive. It will be the heaviest barrage of the war yet, concentrated across 3 sectors. 4639 was heavily bombarded for 5 consecutive days to soften up the defenses in preparation for the attack. The guns remorselessly pounded their targets, turning no man's land and the forward enemy position into a cratered moonscape. From the trenches it seemed nothing could survive such a long and heavy bombardment. The guns hit everything that could be seen: tank traps, razor wire, bunkers, service roads that might provide rapid movement to the enemy. It was a devastating display of firepower, and it kept going day after day. Everything was ready, the bombardment intensified briefly and the explosions fused into a single constant noise. And then they stopped shooting, an horrible silence all that was left in their wake. And as the defenders of the citadel of Vraks rushed out of their bombed shelters to man the guns, the Kriegs emerged from their trenches.
10 yards. 20 yards. The infantry advanced unhindered. Then the guns began to rattle. Heavy bolter rounds flashed across no man's lands, eating up the grounds as the shells exploded amongst the ranks of advancing guardsmen. Onward came the Death Corps, resolute and steadfast, the front ranks in parade ground order. And so they died, scythed down by enemy fire, man after man as they walked headlong into a pitiless hurricane of fire. Next, enemy artillery fire began to land. The guns had been pre-sighted, and the fire was accurate and lethal. Suddenly, no man's land was alive with explosions. Plumes of flames and earth were fountaining amongst the attackers' lines. Clouds of smoke and dust thickened the air. Bodies were flung high into the air like ragdolls by the shell impacts. But still the advancing lines did not falter. On they came, walking ever forward into the firestorm. In the short distances across no man's land, thousands died in minutes. They fell in their lines as enemy fire swept through them. As the intensity of the fire grew, some squads went to the ground, scrambling into shell craters for cover, only for more plunging enemy artillery to land amongst them. Officers urged their platoons onwards, only to be cut down in their turn. Back in the trenches, the next squads were assembling. As shells and bullets whined overhead, they fixed bayonets and waited their turn in the maelstrom. They did not have long to wait, and with the enemy already manning his positions, they climbed up their ladders to be immediately hit, many falling backwards into the trench and onto their comrades below. Few would make even 10 yards from the parapet before being forced to ground.
The violence that exploded in that single charge was staggering. In a few minutes, whole platoons had been annihilated by enemy fire. No man's land was littered with corpses and the agonizing wounded. Some survivors pushed on and managed to reach the enemy lines, charging the defensive walls with bayonets raised. But even there, they were met by an enemy who fought hard and held his position to the last man. As hundreds died in the assault, in the second line, the second wave was preparing for their turn to attack. Grenadier squads advancing forward in their heavy armor, standing proud even as they walked into a charge against certain death. Regardless, they charged, adding their bodies to their comrades that died in the first wave when the wall of fire resumed against them. All day long the slaughter continued, until night arrived and the attack stopped. No man's land was seemingly alive with wounded soldiers that weren't capable of crawling back to their attack lines. Few survivors remained, hiding in craters left by the explosion of shells, and sometimes trying to push forward towards their objective. The cost of the attack had been terrific, and the gains had been negligible. And at dawn, the endless artillery bombardments of both sides resumed. The third wave attacked regardless as programmed, but they too would be almost destroyed in the charge. The desired breakthrough never came. The information the Imperium had was wrong. The defense line's construction work had been completed, and if anything, it was now even more formidable than it was expected to be from the intel provided to the Imperium. 218, 813, and 41. The surviving units of Kriegs retreated back into their trenches, but now it was the enemy that would launch a counterattack against them, hoping to exploit its prior victory and knowing the Kriegs were currently in a weakened state. The traitors of Vraks emerged into no man's land, charging either on foot or riding chimera carriers. As the Kriegs and many more of their units manned their weapons, starting to pin the enemy down with concentrated fire with quad launchers and heavy mortars. Trench line R462-3892 under command of Lieutenant Marot and the survivors of the 3 platoons that had tried the attack a few days before, was completely overrun by a mass of infantry that appeared in no man's land. His Vox messages for defensive artillery barrages were ignored. The lieutenant and his men fought bitterly to the last man, first with their weapons and then in melee when their trench was stormed, and he died laying in the trench after a chainsword cut his left arm off. The enemy attempted to rush to the next section of the line, but they found stiffer resistance that halted them, before they were wiped out when the Kriegs bombed their frontline trenches to pieces, with everyone inside of it. For the subsequent weeks of fighting, very little progress was made. It was a constant push on both sides, a deadly dance of raid and counter-raid that saw the battlefields move minimally in that period. Bombardments continued incessantly as the Vraksians and the Kriegers dueled with explosive shells day and night. The 88th Siege Army was losing an average of 2,000 men a day, even without any regiment actually launching an attack. But more troops kept coming in to replace their losses. The situation in the trenches was horrific. The Kriegers were forced to live like rats, hiding in holes and fighting against the bombardments and the climate of Vraks, with the downpours often turning their trenches into swamps. And once the water drained away in the ground, it left behind heaps of mud that the Kriegers had to fight in. The surroundings were always filled with explosions from constant bombardments. The guns were roaring constantly, and at night, the horizon was constantly illuminated by explosions. Recovering the bodies from no man's land was not an option, and at night the quartermasters would crawl amongst the corpses abandoned in the mud, to salvage any usable equipment to issue to the new Krieg arrivals that replaced the dead. And with the dead being impossible to recover, obviously, they would be left rotting all around no man's land for all the troops around to see.
Vraks was a wasteland of monochromatic gloom, grey and black, overcast with a pall of smoke that blocked out the sun's light. The air was filled with the thickening stench of putrefaction. Where attacks had failed, the unburied dead lay everywhere, because under the non-stop shelling, any attempt to recover bodies often just resulted in more dead. The stinking corpses were rotting away. Day after day, the heavy guns pounded the dead, until all bodies were quartered and quartered again. No man's land was filled with dismembered, stinking fragments that had once been men. Shell holes exposed the remains of decomposing soldiers. Soon both sides were mounting skulls and bones on their positions as macabre shrines to their sacrifices. Death surrounded them. As the months of stalemate passed, the air and the very ground became poisonous with infection. So the first year of the siege slipped past. The outer defense lines had held against the first assaults, and both sides must content themselves with wearing down the other. One day, Something, somewhere must give. But until then, the armies were locked in a grinding stalemate of slow destruction.
And that something will give, in a battle that is known in the records of the Siege of Vraks as the Battle of Fort A453. 897, 814, and 41. After 6 months of inactivity in which some regiments of the Kriegs had to rebuild their strength, the 261st Regiment was ordered to conduct a probing attack in Sector 45-49. Specifically, the 9th Company had been given a very difficult task, attacking a strong point in the enemy line, designated as Fort A453.
Ah, he said the thing!
A453 was a strong position of interlinked bunkers and pillboxes, but his main weaponry, a casemate-mounted air-shaker cannon, had already been destroyed by a direct hit from a bombard siege shell. Still, the battered pillboxes were filled with heavy bolters, each with interlocking fields of fire out across no man's land. It was also surrounded by an anti-tank ditch, mines and thick bands of razor wire. It was also based on underground shelters and stores for the garrisoning troops, all approachable in safety by an underground tunnel that ran back into enemy territory. One previous attack had already been repulsed from the fort. In darkness, the commander of the 9th Company, Captain Tyborg, saw the final preparations of his men. At the first light of dawn, he would lead the attack, while the officers observed from a safe distance to gauge the fort's strength. A battery of TAT guns had also been dragged forward to engage the fort directly as the attack took place. Before dawn, the bombardment started against the fortress, as Tyborg's leading platoon crowded into the forward trenches ready to attack. And as the sun came up, he was the first to climb the ladder. The previous bombardment had left no man's land shrouded in smoke, and at first the attack covered the open ground quickly. They had just to cover 300 yards to reach the fort. After the first 100 yards, the enemy had not responded. Tyborg urged 9th Company on, gathering pace as the enemy razor wire approached. Then the heavy bolters opened fire. The squad didn't stop its advance even as the bullets started whistling overhead, and frantically they cut away the wire once they reached it. The squads at the rear of the attack though were taking casualties and becoming pinned down by the hail of bullets, but the captain and his command squad rolled under the wire and plunged down into the anti-tank ditch. As more men reached the ditch, they discovered that it was littered with mines. Now Tyborg's men were trapped. They could fall back across no man's land through enemy fire, or risk the mines. Tyborg waved them on, regardless of casualties, and to set the example, decides to run up the slope through the mines. He survived the charge, and others followed, but some weren't as lucky, and they were obliterated by the mines. But when they climbed on the other side of the ditch, they were instantly targeted by heavy bolters. Captain Tyborg would be wounded in the leg by a shard of bone, as the guardsman next to him exploded in a welter of blood. At that point, Tyborg ordered his men to assault the pillbox. As they charged against the fortification, they found themselves facing some defenders that emerged from their overnight shelters. An end-to-end combat was suddenly spreading through the fort, and then it was complete chaos. Quad launcher rounds began to land, killing both sides indiscriminately. Tyborg was wounded again by shrapnel as his men swarmed over the first pillbox, throwing grenades through the firing slits to kill the gunners inside. They had gained a foothold inside. Now they needed to keep it, no matter the cost. Bleeding heavily, Captain Tyborg took cover behind an overturned barricade of rock-filled fuel drums and sandbags. All around him, his men were firing at the emerging defenders. His Voxcaster operator was missing, probably dead, but the 9th Company needed urgent reinforcements to hold the ground they had captured. He summoned a runner to take a message back.
9th Company within wire. Enemy in growing strength. Will hold if reinforced.
Who the fuck is speaking?
It's me, Special Narrator Pio. I will appear from time to time throughout the story.
For an agonizing hour, Tyborg's men fought their isolated battle. A second pillbox had been turned into smoking ruin by a flamer, and now they were using the enemy's own trenches to move towards the central bunker. They captured an entrance to a personnel shelter, and after a meltagun blasted the steel door into molten metal, Tyborg led his men down the steps into the bunker below. He was faced by a long gallery, across which hastily erected barricades had been built. Last shots flashed in the dim lights, bullets ricocheted off the walls. As Tyborg limped forward, he ordered those with him to charge. They rushed against the defenders with leveled bayonets, and cleared the gallery. Here Tyborg was wounded for a third time, taking a head wound from an enemy bullet, but his now shattered helmet had saved his life.
This man is unironically too devoted to his mission to die.
Tyborg's men had cleared the gallery just in time, as outside it was now audible that a bombardment had started. The enemy had called for artillery fired inside its own position, killing everyone in it with shrapnel and high explosives. But underground, Tyborg and his men were safe. The bombardment effectively ended the battle above ground, but as Tyborg's stragglers held the gallery, they noticed that no reinforcements came. Obviously the runner had not made it back. They were effectively alone and stuck in an enemy bunker. But he was wrong. The runner was wounded, but it had made it back and delivered the message. The general was now screaming orders to his Vox operators and ordering grenadier units to get ready and follow in the steps of the 9th Company. As diversionary attacks were launched across the entire line, followed by heavy bombardments to tie down the enemy, Tyborg and his men still held the command bunker. Early the next day, grenadier units were working their way towards the fort under heavy artillery fire, but they were the ones having it easy at the moment. In the bunker, Tyborg's men fought a ferocious close-quarter struggle in the galleries and corridors underneath A453. In pitch darkness, illuminated only by the flash of exploding grenades. The enemy was charging at them from the access tunnel, but they were struggling to break through. Tyborg's men looted the enemy dead for weapons as their own ammunitions and grenades ran out. They barricaded the doorways and held them until their defenders were hit, and then others would immediately replace them. The Kriegs were using the bodies of their own dead to add to the barricades. Only 16 men were left at this point, and while the explosive shells exploded above their bunker, they fought on with everything they could. By nightfall, the grenadiers had cleared the remaining surface structures and were fighting to gain access to the underground shelter. The turning point came on the 3rd day of the battle. A453 was almost in Krieg hands, and the enemy was furiously counterattacking to recover it. But General Durjan had secured the release of 3 companies of the 61st Tank Regiment from reserve, along with a Baneblade heavy tank, and now he threw them into the battle around the fort. The Liman Rases and the Baneblade raced through the continued barrage of enemy shells, accompanied by Atlas excavators equipped with dozer blades to fill in the anti-tank ditch and allow the tanks to cross. It took all morning and several Atlases to fill the ditch before the Baneblade and Liman Rases could move forward. As the tanks joined the grenadiers in the attack, General Durjan threw more men into the breach. All along the battle line, the death corps of Krieg were now furiously attacking. The situation, however, in the bunker where Tyborg and his men were holding out was dire. The enemy was now attacking with flamers, trying to burn them out of their defensive positions. They had no such weapons to respond with. Asphyxiating black smoke filled the corridors, and Tyborg was down to his last respirator filter, and he knew that when he failed, the air down there would kill him. He was also out of water, and his last pistol was out of charge. He had suffered new wounds to his legs and stomach, and pinned into one gallery in a bunker, he knew the end would soon arrive. Following the flamethrower attack, the enemy rushed the gallery again. They were cut down at the doorway by last gunfire and grenades. The Kriegsmen rushed to loot the corpses, and one of the dead was still carrying his flamer, the fuel canister half full. Captain Tyborg took it for himself and coated the entrance to the bunker in a sheet of burning promethium. He kept on spraying it until the fuel in the canister ran out. The grenadiers by that point had forced their way into the underground complex, suffering heavy losses, but now they held the main access tunnel. They fought all night and even placed demolition charges at the access point of the tunnel, to use if the enemy tried to retake it. Just before dawn, a grenadier watchmaster signaled he had found survivors. Narrowly avoiding friendly fire as the two forces found each other's, some men still survived in the now Krieg-held bunker system. Captain Tyborg staggered from his bolt hole, wounds in both legs, his right arm, his abdomen and his head. And with just 8 wounded men still alive under his command, he was still carrying a flamer with an empty fuel canister. His uniform was ragged and scorched, his helmet was shattered, but he was alive, and more importantly, the fort had been captured. The 30th Line Corps pressed hard. More men and tanks were funneled into the breakthrough at Fort A453, widening the gap. The enemy had to direct forces from other sectors in an attempt to stem the tide, leaving them dangerously low on men. Where once there was endless stalemate, now the Death Corps were advancing. Over the next 10 days, the battle raged above ground. Briefly, this was no longer a grinding trench war, but fighting in the open ground. The tanks of the Death Corps of Krieg pushed eastwards, and the enemy threw repeated attacks at them. The wastelands were littered with the detritus of battle. Burned out Vraks, abandoned artillery guns and weapons as the breakthrough gradually forced its way eastwards. As the Kriegs turned to move north and south from the breach, the defensive position positions, designed to face outwards, suddenly outflanked and attacked from behind, became untenable. Enemy units started to abandon their defenses and move back to the second line of defense, and they moved quickly to reach it. The soldiers of the 12th Line Corps and 34th Line Corps followed them after breaking through the line in various sections, Death Rider companies pursuing the enemy hard as they fell back en masse. Behind the cavalry, infantry companies were advancing in unopposed columns. After 2 years of bitter attritional warfare, the first defense line had fallen, collapsed like a house of cards. The first objective of the siege of Vraks was now completed.
Damn! Collapsing the first set of formidable defenses of Vraks in 2 years. The Kriegs are men of pure dedication.
Dedication and complete disdain for failure. If they need to give their lives for their objectives, they will.
Fascinating. You know, maybe I should hire some of them for my war against the RSPO.
You are not stealing my wallet again to do that.
Damn it!
With the Krieg breakthrough, the enemy had abandoned not only its outer defense line, but also the northern line, itself a spur of the second defense line, now undefendable due to the situation on the ground. It was outflanked to the south and faced by the Krieg 1st and 30th Line Corps, which after a period of recuperation, were both now ready to attack again. Pinned by enemy attacks to the front, any defenders could quickly be cut off by the advance of the 12th Line Corps. If the defenders stood firm, then it would only be a matter of time until they were surrounded and completely annihilated. So instead of risking a catastrophic defeat by holding onto untenable ground, the defenders decided to withdraw further. The 1st and 30th Line Corps found the northern defense lines abandoned, and were soon pushing forwards against only light resistance from rearguards, snipers, and inevitable harassing artillery fire. The 1st Corps swung eastwards, in the direction of Up Zone 1, which lay astride one of the main routes between the Citadel and the Starport. So far, in over 2 years of war, the 88th Siege Army have been constantly on the attack, with the Vraxian rebels willing to hold their positions and fight a defensive war, except when required to launch counterattacks to retake lost ground, or spoiling raids into the enemy lines. In 255, 815 and 41, the strategic situation changed. As the 1st Line Corps closed in from the north towards the 2nd defense line, it was to be subjected to the enemy's first concentrated offensive of the war. The northern defense line might have been abandoned without a fight, but the ground between the two positions have been identified as the scene of a strong counterattack. The defenders had gathered a substantial armored reserve at Up Zone 1. Lima Rasses, Chimeras, Basilisks and Griffons had all been deployed there, along with crews in order to conduct the counterattack, catching the Krieg regiments of the 1st Corps whilst they were out of their well-defended trenches, marching over open ground. The 19th Siege Regiment was occupying overnight positions in Sector 6053. Its forward sentries reported hearing the movement of enemy vehicles throughout the night, and, in response, harassing artillery fire was increased in an attempt to impede whatever the enemy was planning. Expecting a local counterattack, the forward companies were reinforced, and a general stand too was issued at dawn. The newly dug trenches, in most places no more than a shallow ditch, were lined with men, last guns at the ready. First came the inevitable artillery bombardment. A few shells at first, before a tornado of bombs started descending from the sky. A mass concentrated artillery fire thundered over the 19th Regiment's positions, rolling and booming like a sea during a storm. Amongst the heavy shelling came smoke shells, unleashing thick white clouds that covered the battlefields, reducing visibility considerably. And finally, behind the smoke, came the first wave of enemy attacks. Drivers shifted into gear, and the tanks and armored carriers rolled forwards across the barren wasteland. Behind them, the sun was just breaking the horizon, a pale orb through the dust clouds thrown up in the attackers' wake. And as the attackers approached, artillery fire ceased. Through dust and smoke, the growing noise of approaching vehicles started to grow, until it sounded like the forges of hell had opened. Tank shells flew into the front trenches, a series of explosions that tore bloody gaps in the crowded trench lines. Reports of squadrons of enemy tanks and chimeras were being received from the entire length of the 19th Regiment's front. As the enemy closed in, the infantry riding inside chimeras and on the rear decks of the tanks disembarked. They yelled out their godless battle cries and swarmed forwards, bayonets fixed, knives, axes, and fighting blades in hand. They charged forward almost in a frenzy as the Krieg guardsmen returned fire with las guns, heavy stabbers, and heavy bolters. They were tearing the attackers to pieces, but the tank fire was slowly destroying the weak and shallow trenches. Tons of earth collapsed inward, burying men alive as whole squads vanished in the growing consuming maelstrom of flame and shrapnel. The enemy were like rabid dogs, hunting in packs as bullets and tank shells sheeted across the wastelands. One after another, Krieg units were overrun, and onwards thundered the enemy tanks. Quad launchers were firing over open sights at the approaching enemy, until they received an order to withdraw. As the Centaur carriers came forward to each up the guns, they were engulfed in a furious barrage. Several guns and carriers were lost, and the Kriegs were forced to drop grenades in the barrels of the guns to sabotage them before retreating. Soon, the enemy was already occupying the abandoned Krieg firing positions. Colonel Adal, the commander of the 19th Regiment, was observing the fighting through the smoke far away from his binoculars, and he could see how dire the situation was. He ordered his reserve companies into the line to try and stop the enemy advance. Adal also requested reinforcements from his corps commander. He urgently needed men, artillery and tanks from the reserves if he was too old, as he decided that he would not retreat and establish a new defense line. The reply came from higher command. No reinforcements were available. He must hold the ground only with the forces at his disposal. There would be no retreat, but the pressure of his defensive line was building, and if the second line of trenches fell, the enemy would break through. Mastering the companies still not engaged, he quickly established a new defense line centered on his own command post. The fighting continued all day, and by mid-afternoon, murderous artillery fire had started again from both sides. The attackers and defenders had become intermingled. One smashed trench was held by one side, whilst the next was held by the other. In the confusion, the enemy held fast, with their tanks in close support. First they held against Adal's artillery fire, and then began to move forward again. During the day, 19 quad launcher and heavy mortar positions had been overrun, and in many cases the enemy turned the guns around, using them until the ammunition stores were spent. The fighting would die down only at night, even if both sides kept probing forward even in the darkness, only to be repulsed by the opposite side. The situation was, to put it simply, confused.
Understatement of the century. You see something moving in the dark, you shoot it, and there is a good chance it might not even be the enemy in these conditions.
At dawn, the enemy attack resumed, and again the artillery began to rain on both sides. Infantry moved forward, blood-soaked soldiers in the angry dawn light, fighting from trench to trench. Overhead the clouds split, and a sudden lightning storm crashed down, and bands of heavy rain started pouring down on all, and soon the battlefield was a swamp. The tanks started advancing forward, and Colonel Adal readied his men for battle. Meanwhile, artillery fire started raining even on his own personal bunker. One shell tore through the roof of his command dugout, but fortunately, the colonel was not present. He was already out amongst the defenders, observing the fire of the guardsmen around him. As the enemy started closing in, the air was thick with bullets and lasgun fire. Tank rounds hit defenders' barricades. The first attack was repulsed, with the colonel himself, lasgun in hand, firing from behind sandbags. A second attack was also stopped, but the shallow trenches to the left and right were now in enemy hands, and the colonel and his men were left isolated. The colonel's only escape route now lay over ground, swept by enemy fire. His command dugout was again blasted by enemy fire, this time from the tanks, and his second in command, Colonel Daine, was killed. Adal was down to just 80 men, and he had no way to communicate with the rear forces. The colonel issued orders to evacuate the wounded as best they could be, and divided his survivors into two groups. The first unit would break out and take news of the enemy breakthrough back. He would instead command a rear guard, and hold for as long as possible, until either relief arrived or he was overrun and killed. He had almost no hope of a rescue, but he would fight as long as possible.
A true man and an exemplary Krieg officer. Already better than the fucking Nepo baby commanding Imperial forces in this war.
The escape group climbed the parapet and started rushing back, dodging from crater to crater under enemy fire. Those that escaped passed on the colonel's report. The colonel's battered survivors instead fought on bravely, until the colonel himself was killed when the enemy brought forwards a hellhound flamethrower tank to smoke them out. Of his fate, nothing was ever known. His body incinerated in the blast of superheated promethium that finally destroyed his command post. With the loss of the command post, the second line had also been breached. The 19th Regiment's position was now simply not savable. They had lost their commander, and there was no longer anybody in a position to coordinate the regiment's actions. Isolated groups fought on, but as a cohesive body, the 19th Regiment was a spent force. A general emergency retreat started, with hundreds of stragglers streaming back, and artillery guns towed back and pulled away to safety before the enemy was also upon them. But much of the equipment had to be abandoned to enemy hands. The First Line Corps were now faced with a crisis. Its entire position was in danger of being compromised by the collapse of the 19th Regiment on its left flank. The enemy will soon be around them and rolling up their shallow trench lines, and this will force them to withdraw. Ground that had been so costly to win was going to have to be given up without a fight in favor of a rapid withdrawal to the defendable position of the 1st defense line. From there, the enemy could be stopped. The 1st Line Corps gathered elements of the 7th Tank Regiments and the surviving Death Rider companies of the 19th Regiment. There it would throw them into the enemy's path in the hope of delaying the advance. They couldn't stop the attack, but it would buy the 1st Line Corps time to retreat. The regiments started to withdraw, but the ground lost was a major setback to Lord Zuelke's campaign timetable. The effect of the bold counterattack and breakthrough were felt throughout the 88th Siege Army. Attacks all along the front were suddenly cancelled, as the supplies needed were requisitioned for the 1st Corps. Reinforcements were also moved, as if the attack broke the 1st defense line, this could mean the war was also lost for good. On the 3rd day of the attack, the enemy tanks continued to roll forward, but the 1st Line Corps had finally repositioned some forces to meet the enemy. Once again, all in an effort to buy time for the retreat to be completed. The tank squadrons of the Kriegs will now engage the armored assault of the enemy, and after a day of fighting and catastrophic losses, the advancing armored assault had been seriously blunted, but at the cost of 40 tanks of various classes and designations. 3 more days of such delaying actions followed. The 19th Siege Regiment had been shredded in the first 2 days, losing over 80,000 men, including their commanding officers, and losses were heavy on both sides of the war, but the main problem was not the loss of men and materials. The narrowly averted disaster meant that all along the front line, attacks that should have been weakening the enemy had not taken place. This gave the enemy the time to organize his defenses, get guns and reserves into position, and the 2nd defense line will now be a far harder obstacle to cross. The 2nd defense line was stronger and thicker than the 1st, and after the successful counterattack, the enemy was now occupying it in strength. To attack the defenses piecemeal would be to invite defeat. No, the 2nd line must be broken as the 1st one had, by slow attrition. The leading infantry companies turned again to their entrenching tools. The Atlas excavators were again called forwards. The trenches, so recently escaped, had to be dug all over again. And so the whole gruesome business started again. The trenches expanded until they joined with the trenches which had previously been the front. The Van Meersland wastes were now crisscrossed with a spidery network of trenches, which, day after day, grew into a labyrinth. The ever-present artillery bombardments began again, and both sides started raining bombs on each other as they had for the past few years. 120, 816, and 41. The 88th Siege Army again committed itself to the offensive. An all-out attack was launched by no less than 6 entire regiments. Day after day, the assault continued at a stunning cost, attacking across a battlefield of shattered bunkers, collapsed trench lines, rusted tangles of razor wire, and the exposed bones of the dead, still rotting where they fell. A monotonous, deadly pattern was soon established that would continue across the entire front for months. After hours of saturation bombardment, the Krieg Guardsmen will surge forward to attack the enemy's front line, be they trenches, defense lines, or interconnected systems of bunkers. In some places the attack will be repelled, leaving mounds of dead across no man's land. In some places the assault will succeed, and the attackers will occupy the defenders' positions, only for the attack to then stall under the counter barrage of the enemy artillery guns, that unleashed an accurate storm of fire on their own positions, leaving the attackers isolated and open to a counter-attack before they could be reinforced. Often this devolved into end-to-end fighting with grenades, bayonets, and entrenching tools that would inevitably drive the Krieg back.
And now you get from where the so annoying shovel memes come from. This single line about entrenching tools generated a joke that became boring 5 minutes after it was created.
This cycle will continue for quite some time with negligible gains. Over the months, hundreds of attacks were made, but there was no breakthrough. Another year passes in stalemate. In the north, the 1st Corps, now reinforced by an influx of new troops arriving from Krieg, was pushing forwards again. Here the trenches were pushing forwards across ground littered with the rusting hulks of destroying tanks and carriers. They were slowly regaining the still devastated territory that they had lost in the counterattack, and it took almost 6 months to recover all the ground lost in just a week. In the end, they gained also the up zone, and were finally in position against the 2nd defense line. During the 88th Siege Army's advance, they had overrun many of Vraks' outer storage facilities. These huge underground bunkers, accessible via large cargo lifts down into the cavernous storehouses below, had been stripped bare. The war materials that had been stored there were gone, plundered to the last round by the rebels and moved closer to the fortress for protection. These supplies were the lifeblood of the defenders, the means of matching the 88th Army's massive logistical support train that saw hundreds of tons of artillery shells being delivered every day, along with shiny new barrels or breech blocks to replace those that had become worn out by overuse. So, as the enemy was still well equipped, the attrition war must continue. And so it did. The tireless, pitiless cycle grinding ever on. Vraks at this point was like an insatiable beast, consuming men and equipment daily. And as the years went on, the conditions on the planet only worsened. The war became static, but never quiet, with constant bombardments and small raids on both sides. 649, 818, and 41. The 158th Regiment made a large raid in Sector 5045. Its objective to capture and destroy a defense laser silo, part of Vraks' network of orbital defenses. The silo had been buried deep to protect it from orbital bombardment, and so any artillery bombardment that preceded the attack had little hope of inflicting much serious damage. The defenders inside were safe, so in order to preserve an element of surprise, the attackers would go in without the usual softening up by artillery. The attack will be led by grenadier squads, infiltrating forwards across no man's land under cover of darkness to quickly seize the silo's surface defenses, before the infantry surged through at dawn to clear the silo. The silo itself was mostly underground, protected on the surface by razor wire, a dense minefield, and several reinforced gun emplacements. On a dark and gloomy night, the grenadier squads set off, stealthily slipping into no man's land and crawling from crater to crater, slithering through the mud. Every time a star shell burst, casting its harsh light over them, everybody froze or played dead, indistinguishable from the corpses they were surrounded by. When the light died, they would resume their advance forward. Those squads that reached the objective found it quiet and set about the task of cutting the first band of wire. As they crept forwards through the clear lane, a star shell sailed into the sky and exploded into a bright yellow orb directly overhead. The grenadiers all froze, only for an eagle-eyed sentry to notice some familiar shapes on the perimeter. The sentry was alerted and cried out, only to be silenced by a last gun shot that flashed out in the darkness.
And here we go.
A heavy bolter opened fire, racking those grenadiers still caught on the wire. In barracks deep below, men were being roused from sleep by bellowing officers. The sneak attack had been spotted. The grenadiers could either fall back or press forwards. Caught on the wire, they would only be massacred. The leading squads scrambled through the wire and rushed forwards, conscious of the minefields they were now trampling over. Explosions lit the night. Weapons fire was crisscrossing the silo. A grenadier watchmaster was yelling for his men to follow him as he sprinted towards the closest bunker, only for his orders to be cut short as a heavy bolter shell decapitated him. Inside the wire, the air was thick with fire, grenade explosions. The wounded were crying out. One bunker was engulfed by a flamethrower blast, turning it into a bright torch, silhouetting the darting grenadiers as they scrambled for cover. From below, the first enemy squads were arriving, running to man weapons and trenches. It was total confusion. As dawn broke with a greenish tingle light, the silo was shrouded in smoke and dust. Watching through scanners, the officers in the trenches opposite could make out very little. The mission accomplished message had not been received, but then again, none of the surviving attackers had returned to report failure. The fight was still ongoing. The order was given for the attack to continue as planned, and, on time, the infantry companies warmed up and out into no man's land. But, unknown to the new attackers, the grenadiers' attack had gone badly. In the confused night fighting, the grenadiers had not cleared the surface defenders, and the following infantry were once again attacking enemy heavy weapons over open ground. It was a massacre. Soon the survivors were struggling back into the cover of their own trenches again. In response, a counter-barrage of bombard batteries targeted the silo, and continued to pulverize the defenders well into the night. The huge explosions thundering across no man's land. The following day, when the thick dust cloud cleared, superficial damage could be seen, but the silo remained intact and functioning. It had been a bitter exchange, but exemplary of the types of engagements being fought up and down the front on a daily basis. Several hundred had died in a hopeless attack. No doubt many more attackers than defenders had perished. Only a few of the attacking grenadiers ever reached their own lines again. Most were killed. Those that were captured were tortured for information and then executed. Their bodies were left hanging on the razor wire as grisly reminders of their fate. But things were soon going to become worse. Until now, the fighting was reserved to humans and abhumans, but something else was moving to reach the planet, and soon, the superhuman strength of the Adeptus Astartes would also clash on Vraks. 7 years had passed since the first artillery salvo had been fired, marking the official start of the siege. 7 years of bitter and grueling fighting that had seen millions slaughtered for the few miles gained. Each side had its victories and its defeats. Both had suffered tremendous losses, but neither side was yet at the point of collapse. In 820 and 41, new reports reaching Lord Commander Zuelker, that by the way is written in 2 different ways throughout the first manual of the Siege of Vraks. I don't know why, but it is annoying. Choose one name and stick to it. I will keep calling him Zuelke, like it was in the beginning of the manual. As I was saying, new reports reaching Lord Commander Zuelke's HQ on Trajan Primaris made for disturbing readings. Not only was his campaign plan still well behind schedule, but, if reports were to be believed, the defenders had also been reinforced. During an attack in Sector 50-49 by the 261st Regiment, in which several Gorgon assault transports had overrun the enemy lines and were threatening to force a gap in the second defense line, the enemy had counterattacked, as he always did, but this time the counterattackers had been power armored Space Marines. Adeptus Astartes in dark blue armor had launched a swift attack that had seen the breach quickly sealed, and all the Gorgons had been destroyed in the battle.
The attack on Sector 5249 left few survivors, his colonel summarized, and thus few saw very little or can't be sure of what they saw. We have only their recollections of garbled Vox reports to go on, but most understood that the traitor militiamen had unexpected allies, powerful allies, whose presence on Vraks, if confirmed, would be troubling indeed. More mutants, hazarded the first company's captain. The colonel shook his head. He intoned gravely, "Space Marines." A deathly silence greeted this pronouncement. Finally, Captain Tybok asked,
How is that possible?
"Unclear at present, but at least 6, maybe more, appear to have joined in the fighting. Urgent aid has been requested from the sector's Lord Commander Militant. Firstly, to identify these traitors from their colors."
But if they have been on Vraks all this time...
The colonel agreed. "Then surely we ought to have been told. Perhaps so. I also doubt they would be fighting for the apostate cardinal now, whatever persuasions he may have inflicted upon them. That means we must consider another, even more disturbing possibility." He didn't have to spell it out. It was best to leave the words unvoiced. Captain Tybok had always been aware of Vraks' proximity to the Eye of Terror. It was considered a bastion against the raging warpstorm, a crucial link in a chain stretching across the Segmentum Obscurus. One more reason why they couldn't let it fall. If their war here had drawn the Eye's attention. "Lord Zuelke has also asked for naval support," the colonel continued. "If the traitors have contacted off-world allies, we need a planetary blockade to ensure no more can land here. I needn't tell you that even a handful of traitors Marines could turn this war against us, let alone whatever other horrors might be summoned."
Wait, the Alpha Legion? If the Alpha Legion is on their side, how is Cardinal Zephan keeping on the line that they are currently fighting against heretic forces? Reminder, the majority of the defenders believes that they are fighting against an heretical incursion on their own planet, but the lie should shatter the moment Chaos Space Marines join them.
There is something you must realize, Pio. The Chaos Legions and especially the Traitor Primarchs are a closely guarded secret inside the universe of 40k. For all the average Imperial citizen knows, there are only 9 Primarchs and their loyalist sons. The commoner doesn't know anything about the Demon Primarchs and the legions of Traitor Space Marines. This was a grave development for the war on Vraks. No Adeptus Astartes force had been committed to Vraks due to the nature of the fighting. No chapter master would expose his battle brothers to a slow-moving war of attrition. The war was locked in a stalemate, but these reinforcements could swing the balance of the war in favor of the defenders.
Goes to show how truly valuable even a small force of Space Marines is in 40k.
Lord Commander Zuelke sent his emissaries to see the Lord Commander Militant of Segmentum Obscurus. In the hope he could help identify the Space Marines. Along with that request, Zuelke also asked for a new line corps to join the fighting on Vraks. He believed that these extra men will bring the campaign back on schedule and help break the stalemate at the second defense line. As the Departmentum Unitorum got to work on finding these extra men from Krieg, the new force of Space Marines on the defender's side remained a mystery. All the chapters in the Segmentum who wore dark blue could all account for their companies. The conclusion was pretty obvious at that point. Traitor Marines, drawn to Vraks by the intensity of the battle and wishing to win favor with their own gods by adding to the slaughter. Zuelke's headquarters was assured that steps were being undertaken to counter the new threat. Unknown to the commanders of the 88th Siege Army, Vraks had indeed become a draw to the Traitor Legions. One traitor in particular particular had heard news of the uprising and the subsequent battles, and had now chosen to join the war. He was Lord Arcos, a former captain of the Alpha Legion. His battle barge, Anarchy's Art, had crept into the Vraks system and landed his battle brothers at the starport. Disguised as newly deployed Loyalist Space Marines, they had infiltrated through the Krieg Lines and, under the guise of launching an attack, crossed no man's land to reach the enemy side, before making for the Citadel. Arcos and his followers presented themselves at the Citadel, offering his support in the name of all the Chaos Gods. Arcos could not only provide the defenders with superb veteran troops, experts at raiding and disruption behind enemy lines, but also training for the militias. Arcos himself could add his own tactical experience to the defensive campaign. His brothers, all unflinchingly loyal to their commander and their gods, would relish the chance to join the war. Vraks, Arcos advised, was the anvil on which the Scarus sector could be smashed. Victory on Vraks could bring about greater victories in the future. One successful rebellion would spark another, and he already had many allies in place to kindle the flames. He also promised more allies to follow. Other warbands would hear of Vraks, and they too will join the fight. Lord Arcos was a useful and powerful ally for Cardinal Zephan, and his aid was gratefully accepted. His veteran brothers were immediately put to work. But that is a story for another day. We're already 7 years into the war, but only now the war is starting to become the brutal conflict that many people know it for.
So Cardinal Zephan is getting help from the minions of the Chaos Gods and the Warp. I wonder if I too could do the same against IRSPO. And so, that's the story of how I arrived here. I never got to the pleasure world I wanted. Zinch gave me bad directions, the bastard Chaos God of Nerds. But enough about me. How did you end up here exactly? Fat Pio.